February 20th devotional, Micah 7:18 and 19. Who is a God like you, who pardons sins and forgives the transgression of the remnant of his inheritance? You do not stay angry forever, but delight to show mercy. You will again have compassion on us. You will tread our sins underfoot and hurl all our iniquities into the depths of the sea. Chapter 18. With the summer months, Judge Pomeroy's health improved, and it was soon he was able to be back in his office. Neil began to plan to return to Boston. He would get there the 1st of August and would go to work with a tutor to make up for the months he had lost. It was a melancholy time for him. He was in a fever of impatience to be gone, and yet he felt that he was going away forever and was making the final break with everything that had been dear to him in his boyhood. The people, the very country itself, were changing so fast that there would be nothing to come back to. He had seen the end of an era, the sunset of the pioneer. He had come upon it when it was already its glory and was nearly spent. So in the Buffalo times, a traveler used to come upon the embers of a hunter's fire on the prairie. After the hunter was up and gone, the coals would be trampled out, but the ground was warm, and the flattened grass where he had slept and where his pony had grazed told the story. This was the very end of the road-making West. The men who had put the plains and mountains under the iron harness were old, some were poor, and even the successful ones were hunting for the rest and a brief reprieve from death. It was already gone, that age. Nothing could ever bring it back. The taste and smell and song of it, the visions those men had had in the air and followed, these he had caught in a kind of afterglow in their own faces, and this would always be his. It was what he most held against Mrs. Forrester, that she was not willing to immolate herself, like the widow of all these great men, and die in the pioneer period to which she belonged, that she preferred life on any terms. In the end, Neil went away without bidding her goodbye. He went away with weary contempt for her in his heart. It happened like this. Had scarcely the dignity of an episode. It was nothing, and yet it was everything. Going over to see her one summer evening, he stopped a moment by the dining room window to look at the honeysuckle. The dining room door was open into the kitchen, and there was Mrs. Foster, stood at a table making a pastry. Ivy Peters came into the kitchen door, walked up behind her, and inconcertedly put both arms around her, his hands meeting over her breast. She did not move, did not look up, but went on rolling out pastry. Neil went down the hill for the last time, he said, as he crossed the bridge in the evening light, for the last time. And it was even so. He never went up to the poplar-bordered road again. He had given her a year of his life, and she had thrown it away. He had helped the captain to die peacefully, he believed, and now it was the captain who seemed the reality. All those years he had thought it was Mrs. Forrester who made the house so different from any other, but ever since the captain's death, it was a house where old friends, like his uncle, were betrayed and cast off, where common fellows behaved after the kind, and knew a common woman when they saw her. If he had not had the nature of a spaniel, he told himself, he would never go back after the first time. It took 2 doses to cure him. Well, he had had them. Nothing she could ever do would in the least matter to him again. He had news of her now and then. As long as his uncle lived, Mrs. Foster's name came in where coupled with Ivy Peters, said the judge wrote. She does not look happy, and I fear her health is failing, but she has put herself in such a position that her husband's friends cannot help her. And again, of Mrs. Forrester, no news is good news. She is sadly broken. After his uncle's death, Neil had heard that Ivy Peters had at last bought the Forrester place and had brought a wife from Wyoming to live there. Mrs. Forrester had gone west, people supposed, to California. It was years before Neil could think of her without chagrin, but eventually she had drifted out of his ken when he did not know if Daniel Forrester's widow were living or dead. Daniel Forrester's wife returned to him a bright and personal memory. He came to be very glad that he had known her and that she had had a hand in breaking him into new life. He has known pretty women and clever ones since then, but never one like her, as she was in her best days. Her eyes, when they laughed for a moment into one's own, seemed to promise a wild delight that he was not found in life. I know where it is, they seemed to say. I could show you. He would like to call upon the shade of the young Mrs. Forrester, as the witch of Endor called upon Samuel's, and challenge it demand the secret of that ardor, ask her whether she had really found some ever-blooming, ever-burning, every-piercing joy, or whether it was all fine play-acting. Probably she had found no more than another, but she had always the power of suggesting things much lovelier than herself, as the perfume of a single flower may call upon the whole sweetness of spring. Neil was destined to hear once again of his long-lost lady. One evening, as he was going into the dining room of a Chicago hotel, a broad-shouldered man with an open, sun-browned face approached him and introduced himself as one of the boys who had grown up in Sweetwater. "I'm Ed Elliott, and I thought it must be you. Could we take a table together? I promised an old friend of yours to give you a message if I ever ran across you. You remember Mrs. Foster? Well, I saw her again 12 years after she left Sweetwater, down in Buenos Aires. They sat down and ordered dinner. Yes, I was in South America on business. I'm a mining engineer. I spent some time in Buenos Aires. One evening there was a banquet of some sort at one of the big hotels, and I happened to step out of the bar just as a car drove up to the entrance where the guests were going in. I paid no attention until one of the ladies laughed. I recognized her by her laugh. That hadn't changed a particle. She was done up all in furs, with a scarf over her head, but I saw her eyes, and then I was sure. I stepped up and spoke to her, and she seemed glad to see me, made me go into the hotel and talk to me until her husband came to drag her away to the dinner. Oh yes, she was married again to a rich, cranky old Englishman. Henry Collins was his name. He was born down there, she told me, but she met him in California. She told me they lived in a big stock ranch and had come down in the car for this banquet. I made inquiries afterward and found the old fellow was quite a character, had been married twice before, once to a Brazilian woman. People said he was rich, but quarrelsome and rather stingy. She seemed to have everything, though. They traveled in a fine French car, and she had brought her maid along, and he is a valet. No, she hadn't changed as much as you think. She was a good deal made up, of course, like most of the women down there. Plenty of powder, and a little red, too, I guess. Her hair was black, blacker than I remember. It looked as though she dyed it. She invited me to visit them on their estate, so did the old man, and when he came to get her, she asked about everybody and said, if you ever meet Neil Herbert, give him my love and tell him I often think of him. She said again, tell him things have turned out well for me. Mr. Collins is the kindest of husbands. I called at your office in New York on my way back from South America, but you were somewhere in Europe. It was remarkable how she come up again. She seemed pretty well gone to pieces before she left Sweetwater. Do you suppose, said Neil, that she could be living still? I'd almost make a trip to see her. No, she died about 3 years ago. I know that for certain. After she left Sweetwater, wherever she was, she always sent a check to the Grand Army Post every year to have flowers put on Captain Forster's grave for Decoration Day. 3 years ago, the post got a letter from the old Englishman with a draft for the future care of Captain Forster's grave in memory of my late wife, Marion Foster Collins. So you may feel sure that she was well cared for to the very end, said Neil. Thank God for that. I know you feel that way, said Ed Elliott. A warm wave of feeling passed over his face. I did. The end. Hope you guys have enjoyed that reading of A Lost Lady, part of my 100 Years of Wonders of what I'm doing with Goodreads. My next book is going to be an Ellen Montgomery book called Blue Castle. So I hope y'all have enjoyed it. Thanks. Bye, y'all. The Blue Castle by Ellen Montgomery, Chapter 1. If it had not rained on a certain May morning, Valancy Sterling's whole life would have been entirely different. She would have gone with the rest of her clan to Aunt Wellington's engagement picnic, and Dr. Trent would have gone to Montreal. But it did rain, and you shall hear what happened to her because of it. Valancy wakened early in the lifeless, hopeless hour just preceding dawn. She had not slept very well. One does not sleep well sometimes when one is 29 on the morrow and unmarried, in a community and connection where the unmarried are simply those who have failed to get a man. Deerwood and the Sterlings had long since relegated Valancy to hopeless old maidenhood. But Valancy herself had never quite relinquished a certain pitiful, shamed little hope that romance would come her way yet. Never until this wet, horrible morning, when she wakened to the fact that she was 29 and unsought by any man. Ah, there lay the sting. Valancy did not mind so much being an old maid. After all, she thought, being an old maid couldn't possibly be as dreadful as being married to an Uncle Wellington or an Uncle Benjamin or even an Uncle Herbert. What hurt her was that she had never had a chance to be anything but an old maid. No man had ever desired her. The tears came into her eyes as she lay there alone in the faintly graying darkness. She dared not let herself cry as hard as she wanted to for two reasons. She was afraid that crying might bring on another attack of pain around her heart. She had had a spell of it after she had got into bed, rather worse than she had had yet. And she was afraid her mother would notice her red eyes at breakfast and keep at her with minute, persistent, mosquito-like questions regarding the cause thereof. Suppose, thought Valancy with a ghastly grin, I answered with the plain truth. I am crying because I cannot get married. How horrified mother would be, though she is ashamed every day of her life as an old maid daughter. But of course appearances should be kept up. It is not, Valancy could hear her mother's prim dictatorial voice asserting, it is not maidenly to think about men. The thought of her mother's expression made Valancy laugh, for she had a sense of humor nobody in her clan suspected. For that matter, there was a good many things about Valancy that nobody suspected. But her laughter was a very superficial, and presently she lay there, a huddled, futile little figure, listening to the rain pouring down outside and watching with a sick distaste the chill, merciless light creeping into her ugly, sordid room. She knew the ugliness of that room by heart, and knew it and hated it. The yellow painted floor with one hideous hooked rug by the bed, with a grotesque hooked dog on it, always grinning at her when she awoke, the faded dark red paper, the ceiling discolored by old leaks and crossed by cracks, the narrow pinched little washstand, the brown paper lantern with blue roses on it, the spotted old looking glass with a crack across it, propped up on the inadequate dressing table, the chart of ancient potpourri made by her mother in her mythical honeymoon, the shell-covered box with one burst corner, which Cousin Stickles had made in her equally mythical girlhood, the beaded pincushion with half of its bead fringe gone, the one stiff yellow chair, the faded omada gone but not forgotten, worked into the colored yarns about great-grandmother Sterling's grim old face, the old photographs of ancient relatives long vanished from the rooms below. There were only two pictures that were not of relatives. One, an old chromo of a puppy sitting on a rainy doorstep. That picture always made Valancy unhappy. That forlorn little dog crouched on the doorstep in the driving rain. Why didn't someone open the door and let him in? The other picture was a faded, passepartout engraving of Queen Louise coming down the stairways, which Aunt Wellington had lavishly given her on her 10th birthday. For 19 years she had looked at it and hated it. Beautiful, smug, self-satisfied Queen Louise. But she never dared destroy it or remove it. Mother and Cousin Stickles would have been aghast, or as Valancy irrelevantly expressed in her thoughts, would have had a fit. Every room in the house was ugly, of course, but downstairs appearances were kept up somewhat. There was no money for rooms nobody ever saw. Valancy sometimes felt that she could have done something for her room herself, even without money, if she was permitted. But her mother had negatived every timid suggestion that Valancy did not present. Valancy never persisted. She was afraid to. Her mother could not brook opposition. Mrs. Sterling would sulk for days if offended, and the airs of an insulted duchess. The only thing Valancy liked about her room was that she could be alone there at night to cry if she wanted to. But after all, what did it matter if a room, which you used for nothing except sleeping and dressing in, were ugly? Valancy was never permitted to stay alone in her room for any other purpose. People who wanted to be alone, so Mrs. Frederick Sterling and Cousin Stickles believed, could only want to be alone for some sinister purpose. For her room in the Blue Castle was everything a room should be. Valancy, so cowed and subdued and overridden and snubbed in real life, was wont to let herself go rather splendidly in her daydreams. Nobody in the Sterling clan or its ramifications suspected this, least of all her mother and Cousin Stickles. They never knew that Valancy had two homes, the ugly red brick box of a home on Elm Street and the Blue Castle in Spain. Valancy had lived spiritually in the Blue Castle ever since she could remember. She had been a very tiny child when she found herself possessed of it. Always, when she shut her eyes, she could see it plainly, with its turrets and banners on the pine-clad mountain height, wrapped in its faint blue loveliness against the sunset skies of a fair and unknown land. Everything wonderful and beautiful was in that castle. Jewels that queens might have worn, robes of moonlight and fire, couches of roses and gold, long flights of shallow marble steps with great white urns with slender mist-clad maidens going up and down them courts, marble pillared, where shimmering fountains fell and nightingales sang among the myrtles, halls of mirrors that reflected only handsome knights and lovely women, herself the loveliest of all, for whose glance men died. All that supported her through the boredom of her days was the hope of going on a dream spree at night. Most, if not all, of the Sterlings would have died of horror if they had known half of the things Valencia did in the Blue Castle. For one thing, she had quite a few lovers in it, only one at a time, one who wooed her with all the romantic ardor of the age of chivalry, and won her after long devotion and many deeds of daring do, and was wedded to her with pomp and circumstance in great banner-hung chapel of the Blue Castle. At 12, this lover was a fair lad with golden curls and heavenly blue eyes. At 15, he was tall, dark, and pale, but still necessarily handsome. At 25, he had a clean-cut jaw, slightly grim, and face strong and rugged rather than handsome. Valencia never grew older than 25 in her Blue Castle, but recently, very recently, her hero had reddish, tawny hair, a twisted smile, and a mysterious past. I don't say Valencia deliberately murdered these lovers as she outgrew them. One simply faded away as another came. Things are very convenient in this respect in Blue Castles. But on the morning of her day of fate, Valencia could not find the key of her Blue Castle. Reality pressed on her too hardly, barking at her heels like a maddening little dog. She was 29, lonely, undesired, ill-favored, the only homely girl in a handsome clan, with no past and no future. As far as she could look back, life was drab and colorless, with not one single crimson or purple spot anywhere. As far as she could look forward, it seemed certain to be just the same until she was nothing but a solitary little withered leaf clinging to a wintry bough. The moment when a woman realizes she has nothing to live for, neither love, duty, purpose, nor hope, holds for her the bitterness of death. And I just have to go on living because I can't stop. I may have to live 80 years, thought Valencia in a kind of panic. We're all horribly long-lived. It sickens me to think of it. She was glad it was raining, or rather, she was drearily satisfied that it was raining. There would be no picnic that day, the annual picnic where Aunt and Uncle Wellington, one always thought of them in that succession, inevitably celebrated their engagement at a picnic 30 years before, had been, of late years, a veritable nightmare to Valencia. By an impish coincidence, it was the same day as her birthday, and after she had passed 25, nobody let her forget it. Much as she hated going to the picnic, it would have never occurred to her to rebel against it. There seemed to be nothing of the revolutionary in her nature, and she knew exactly what everyone would say to her at the picnic. Uncle Wellington, whom she disliked and despised, even though she had fulfilled the highest sterling aspiration, marrying money, would say to her in a pig's whisper, "Not thinking of getting married yet, my dear?" and then go off into the bellow of laughter, with which he invariably concluded with his dull remarks. Aunt Wellington, of whom Valencia stood in abject awe, would tell her about Olive's new chiffon dress and Cecil's last devoted letter. Valencia would have to look as pleased and interested as if the dress and the letter had been hers, or else Aunt Wellington would be offended. And Valencia had long ago decided that she would rather offend God than Aunt Wellington, because God might forgive her, but Aunt Wellington never would. Aunt Alberta, nervously fat, with the amiable habit of always referring to her husband as he, as if he were the only male creature in the world, who could never forget that she had been a great beauty in her youth, would condole with Valencia on her sallow skin. "I don't know why all the girls of today are so sunburned. When I was a girl, my skin was roses and cream. I was counted the prettiest girl in Canada, my dear." Perhaps Uncle Herbert wouldn't say anything, or perhaps he would remark jocularly, "How fat you're getting, Doss," and then everybody would laugh over the excessively humorous idea of poor, scrawny little Doss getting fat. Handsome, solemn Uncle James, who Valencia disliked but respected because he was reputed to be very clever and was therefore the clan oracle, brains being none too plentiful in the Sterling connection, would probably remark with the owl-like sarcasm that had won him his reputation, "I suppose you're busy with your hope chest these days?" And Uncle Benjamin would ask someone of his abominable conundrums between wheezy chuckles and answer them himself, "What is the difference between Doss and a mouse? The mouse wishes to harm the cheese, and Doss wishes to charm the he's." Valencia had heard him ask that riddle 50 times, and every time she wanted to throw something at him, but she never did. In the first place, the Sterlings simply did not throw things. In the second place, Uncle Benjamin was a wealthy and childless old widower, and Valencia had been brought up in the fear and obligation of his money. If she offended him, he would cut her out of his will, supposing she was in it. Valencia did not want to be cut up on Uncle Benjamin's will. She had been poor all her life and knew the galling bitterness of it. So she endured his riddles and even smiled tortured little smiles over him. And Isabel, downright and disagreeable as an east wind, would criticize her in some way. Valencia could not predict just how, for Aunt Isabel had never repeated a criticism. She found something new which to jab you at every time, and Isabel prided herself on saying what she thought, but she didn't like it so well when other people said what they thought to her. Valencia never said what she thought. Cousin Georgiana, named after her great-great-grandmother, who had been named after George IV, would recount decorously the names of all the relatives and friends who had died since the last picnic and wonder which of us would be the first to go next. Oppressively competent Aunt Mildred would talk endlessly of her husband and her odious prodigies of babies to Valencia because Valencia could be the only one she could find to put up with it. For the same reason, Cousin Gladys, really first Cousin Gladys, once removed, according to the strict way in which the Sterlings tabulate relationship, a tall, thin lady who admitted she had a sensitive disposition, would describe minutely the tortures of Eunice, and Olive, the wonder girl of the whole Sterling clan, who had everything Valencia had not, beauty, popularity, love, would show off her beauty and presume on her popularity and flaunt her diamonds, insignia of love, in Valencia's dazzled, envious eyes. There would be none of this today, and there would be no packing up of teaspoons. The packing up was always left for Valencia and Cousin Stickles, and once, 6 years ago, a silver teaspoon from Aunt Wellington's wedding set had been lost. Valencia never heard the last of that silver teaspoon. Its ghost appeared banquet-like at every subsequent family feast. Oh yes, Vancelli knew exactly what the picnic would be like, and she blessed the rain that had saved her from it. There would be no picnic this year. If Aunt Wellington could not celebrate on the sacred date itself, she would have no celebration at all. Thank whatever gods there were for that. Since there would be no picnic, Valencia made up her mind that, if the rain held up in the afternoon, she would go up to the library and get another of John Foster's books. Valencia was never allowed to read novels, but John Foster's books were not novels. They were nature books. So the librarian told Mrs. Frederick Sterling all about the woods and birds and bugs and things that, so Valencia was allowed to read them, under protest, for it was only too evident that she enjoyed them too much. It was permissible, even laudable, to read to improve your mind and your religion, but a book that was enjoyable was dangerous. Valencia did not know whether her mind was being reproved or not, but she felt vaguely that if she had come across John Foster's books years ago, life might have been a little different thing for her. They seemed to her to yield glimpses of a world into which she might have once entered, though the door was forever barred to her now. It was only within the last year that John Foster's book had been in the Deerwood Library, though the librarian told Valencia that he had been a well-known writer for several years. Where does he live? Valencia had asked. Nobody knows. From his books he must be a Canadian, but no more information can be had. His publishers won't say a word. Quite likely John Foster is his nom de plume. His books are so popular we can't get them in. Can't keep them in at all, though. I really can't see what people find in them to rave about. I think they're wonderful, Valencia said timidly. Oh, well, Mrs. Clarkson smiled in a patronizing fashion that regulated Valencia's opinions to limbo. I can't say I care much for bugs myself, but certainly Foster seems to know all there is to know about them. Valencia didn't know whether she cared so much for bugs either. It was not John Foster's uncanny knowledge of wild creatures and insect life that enthralled her. She could hardly say what it was, some tantalizing lure of a mystery never revealed, some hint of a great secret just a little further on, some faint, elusive echo of lovely forgotten things. John Foster's magic was indefiable. Yes, she would get a new Foster book. It was a month since she had Thistle Harvest, so surely Mother could not object. Valencia had read it 4 times. She knew whole passages of it by heart, and she almost thought she would go and see Dr. Trent about the queer pain around her heart. It had come rather often lately, and the palpitations were becoming annoying, not to speak of an occasional dizzy moment and a queer shortness of breath. But she could go to him without telling anyone. It was a most daring thought. None of the Sterlings ever consulted a doctor without holding a family council and getting Uncle James' approval. Then they went to Dr. Ambrose Marsh of Port Lawrence, who had married second cousin Adelaide Sterling. Valancy disliked Dr. Ambrose Marsh, and besides, she could not get to Port Lawrence, 15 miles away, without being taken there. She did not want anyone to know about her heart. There would be such a fuss made, and every member of the family would come down and talk it over and advise her and caution her and warn her and tell her horrible tales of great aunts and cousins 40 times removed who had once been just like that and dropped dead without a moment's warning, my dear. And Isabel would remember that she had always said Dawes looked like a girl who would have heart trouble, so pinched and peaked always. And Uncle Wellington would take it his personal insult when no Sterling ever had heart disease before, and Georgiana would forbade her perfectly audibly aside that poor dear little Dawes isn't long for this world, I'm afraid. And Cousin Gladys would say, why, my heart has been like that for years. And the tone implies that no one else had any business even to have a heart, and Olive would merely look beautiful and superior and disgustingly healthy, as if to say, why all this fuss over a faded superfluity like Dawes when you have me? Valancy felt that she couldn't tell anybody unless she had to. She felt quite sure there was nothing at all seriously wrong with her heart, and no need for all the bother that would ensue if she mentioned it. She would just slip up quietly and go see Dr. Trent that very day. As for his bill, she had the $200 that her father had put in the bank for her the day she was born, but she would secretly take out enough to pay Dr. Trent. She was never allowed to use even the interest of this. Dr. Trent was a gruff, outspoken, absent-minded old fellow, but he was recognized authority on heart disease. Even if he were only a general practitioner in the out-of-wood Deerwood, Dr. Trent was over 70, and there had been rumors that he meant to retire soon. None of the Sterling clan that had ever gone to him since he had told Cousin Gladys 10 years before that her nearest was all imaginary and that she enjoyed it. You couldn't patronize a doctor who insulted your first cousin once removed like that. Not to mention that he was a Presbyterian when all the Sterlings went to the Anglican church. But Valancy, between the devil of disloyalty to clan and the deep sea of fuss and clatter and vice, thought she would take a chance with the devil.